Hi, everyone. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about research and drafting. This is really the process part of writing and coming up with a document. You're going to find that a lot of the information that's in this presentation is kind of hodgepodge. It's put together. It's a whole lot of different kinds of processes put into one, and I'm also kind of assuming some familiarity with things like outlining, brainstorming, things like that. So we're kind of skipping what we in the field call the invention stage and going right into research, which is a part of invention, but also can be a part of the drafting stage. So really, I'm having you guys think right now about gathering information, putting information together, and then beginning to draft information, and thinking about how you can put ideas together. So first, to talk about research, two things I want you to take away as far as research goes. One, the kind of research that you do is going to depend on your audience. For example, if you write a paper for a class, the research you do needs to be academic because your audience is an academic audience. If you are researching something for a more public audience, if you're researching something for a blog post, or if you're researching something for a marketing document of some kind, your research may look a little bit different. You may not be using explicitly scholarly sources, but you're still using reliable and relevant sources. So just because something is not scholarly, peer-reviewed in an academic journal, does not mean that it's not reliable. It's not a reliable source or a credible source. It just means that it's going to have a different kind of clout in different environments. The second thing I want you guys to think about and to remember is that the research that you do is going to determine your credibility across all documents, across all situations. The evidence that you can provide for whatever argument or claim you're making is going to mean everything. It's the foundation for what you're trying to communicate, and so if it's not founded on a stable ground, then you can't really get anywhere with it. So what is a relevant and reliable source? Again, it depends on the audience. The left-hand column are my bullet points for relevance. The right-hand column are my bullet points for reliability. So a relevant source has a clearly articulated purpose and goal. It has a question, a problem, or some issue to address. In other words, there's something that it has to do. It's not just, speaking. It's not just speaking to speak for its own sake. It's actually doing something. It has what we call an exigency. The evidence that is used is relevant to the stated purpose. The arguments and interpretations are based on the information that's presented there, and the assumptions, concepts, and ideas are clearly articulated. If you look at this, a lot of these are perhaps the criteria that I might use to grade a paper. And really, the relevance and reliability of a source often overlap with those same criteria. Is it a well and thought out piece of writing? Is it appropriate to the given situation? So reliability is often about the author and the ways in which the author goes about making an argument. The author is going to be an expert in their field. Again, this depends on the field. The author doesn't necessarily have to be a researcher at MIT. They can also be a CEO of a Fortune 500 company. The author is going to cite reputable sources. Not only will they have citations, but those citations need to be reliable themselves. That indicates reliability as a source. The source was published relatively recently, and this depends based on your field, but typically in what I find in business journals and in business, you want to have something from within the past 3 years. The funding structures for the research are dedicated to accuracy. This is something that's come up, especially in recent years. Um, Perhaps a government agency that has a political bend, a particular political bend, funds research, and of course it comes out in a specific way. This happens in industry all the time, where a company is going to shell out money for a research project, and of course, because they're there to make a profit, those researchers are going to be looking for a given kind of truth. That doesn't mean that this research is inaccurate completely, but the funding structures for the research or for the information is increasingly more important for us to pay attention to. The author checks their bias and perhaps even actively does so. You might see this happening with certain language like, I understand my position here, or I'm trying to think of another example. Oftentimes this will happen in a results section where, or a conclusion of a research project, where people acknowledge that there could have been missteps in the procedure. So this is where an author might check their bias. And then the information is stable. A really good example of this is Wikipedia. Wikipedia is a good source in some regards. However, it specifically is not always useful because it is changing constantly. And so when information is changing constantly, it's hard to say that it's reliable. So as you find your research and you're reading it, here's some things that you should be thinking about and you should be doing as you go. You want to actively read. I asked you to do this in my class, and so this is just an extension of that. I often, when I'm reading journal articles for myself, I will keep what's called a double entry journal. On one side of my page, I have quotes from the article. On the other side, I have responses to it. So I'm actively engaging with the language and the article and the information as I go. Summarizing each section is always great. Also, be sure that you're reading in order to understand, which often means writing as you go, asking questions, no matter how small or insignificant they may seem. Also, as far as reading a lot of information, it's often important to understand how a document is set up, and that can give you a kind of efficiency to your process. So, reading the abstracts or summaries of an article before reading the entire article, not to replace the reading of that article, but to know, okay, I know what's in the article, I know what to look for. These are the important points, so I know what to look for as I'm going through. Look to headings or certain transition signposts for an indication of the structure of the article or the document. Look for main ideas or arguments, which are often at the beginning of paragraphs. Topic sentences, think of it that way. Look for evidence, which is often in the middle of the paragraph. And then read the conclusion. Always read the conclusion so that you can walk away with the bottom line of the research or of the information. And honestly, these are good ways for you to think about how to write a piece of business documentation or business writing as well. Thinking about these as the things people look for and the things people will pay attention to, and understanding that they're actually a very important part of your document. And always, I think it's hard to do a lot of research without kind of playing into your own bias. And we've talked about this before, confirmation bias, paying attention to what you want to pay attention to. So be willing from the get-go as you go into your research, be willing to acknowledge the shortcomings that you have. And this goes too for the interview that you conduct. Be willing to understand that you may ask a question that you're not going to get the answer you want. You may have to phrase things in certain ways, and it may not make sense to you because, of course this makes sense to me. Why can't this person understand what I'm saying? But be sure that you're paying attention to these three very common shortcomings that come up whenever people research. One is confirmation bias. It's a tendency to ignore or discredit information that contradicts what you believe. Egocentrism is closely related. It's using self-centered standards or self-centered standards rather than audience-centered standards to decide what to value. And then sociocentrism, which is using society-centered or group-centered criteria rather than audience-centered to decide what to keep or reject. And this can often lead to groupthink, self-selecting for specific group values as opposed to considering all that's actually there. So once you do that, what do you do with all the information? What I think a lot of students don't realize is that research isn't just going out and finding, which is the very first step, compiling. It's also reading, and it's also sitting with that information, letting it sink in a bit. So we have a whole lot of steps as far as gathering information goes. First, we compile, which I just mentioned. We then prime ourselves. So we start to this is kind of a digestion stage where we're starting to grapple with the ideas. We're starting to truly understand them as opposed to just being immediately exposed to them. Exposing is where we're exposed to many different ideas or many different ways of saying the same thing. And this can happen through other research or through our own kind of self-talking that we do. Assimilating, accommodating is the process of understanding the research in relation to other research. So either making sense of other research in light of this or accommodating certain viewpoints in that specific situation. And then incubating, this is where oftentimes it looks like, I think, for me, it looks like I'm not doing work when I incubate. I kind of, sit back and I may, take a nap or I may watch TV for a little bit. It's letting that information actually start to work inside your brain kind of on a biological level. That's a good part of the process. So I don't want you guys to forget that there is a time in which you aren't doing anything with the research, and that's okay. You then begin incorporating it together. You've compiled everything you need. You've understood it all. Now you're starting to incorporate it into an argument. You're then producing, so you're building from how the synthesis has worked prior, and then finally you're revising. So you're revising that information, that synthesis that you've created. Only after you've spent this time with the data, really, really steeped in it, can you make a reasonable argument about what it says. And I think this is really important, that a lot of times we decide something and then we go find out research that backs it up. But really, the way that good research works is that we look at the data and then make a decision. So from that, we move to thinking about thesis statements, or in business communication, this is more often called a purpose statement. Occasionally, a business document will have an embedded thesis, meaning it's, a couple paragraphs in or even a page in. But more often than not, if you think about time constraints as an important value in business communication, more often than not, this purpose statement is upfront and clearly stated. In fact, it's often the very first statement all on its own on the executive summary. So a thesis statement is a declarative statement. It's a complete sentence. It uses specific language. It's a single idea. And it considers its audience. So an example of this report will describe the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats that were uncovered in our market research, and will suggest the company take action on the specific problem of internal communications. Now, this is a little bit more complex than a single idea, but still those two ideas are connected to one another. So from here, we really start the drafting stage. We have a thesis statement or a purpose statement. We know our end goal, and we have research to work with. So one of the things I ask you to do in this assignment is to think about a guiding structure, an organizational structure for your document. And luckily for the SWOT analysis, you have a built-in structure already, which is a categorical structure. Strengths in one section, weaknesses in another, opportunities and threats in another. But if you're working, for example, on a proposal, you're going to have quite a different experience. You're going to have to choose based on the information that you have, based on the argument and the complexity of that argument. You're going to have to choose a structure. And so there's a lot of different kinds of structures. I've listed them here, and especially when you get into the formal proposal assignment, I encourage you to go look up, how one might structure a report or a proposal, because you'll see these words here, and you'll have an idea of what you can do with information you have. And here's some more that you have here. So that's an overriding structure. That's paragraph level structure. As far as sentence level structure, or what's within a paragraph, and this is something I want you guys to do in your outlines, is to think of the paragraph as a 4-part piece of writing. The first, you have your topic sentence, which can often state it often does state the claim of the paragraph. Though it doesn't have to. So then you have your claim. Then you have a statement regarding your evidence or the data. It's supportive, it's relevant to this particular claim, and it's effective. And then you have your explanation. So you need to clearly link the data that you've just given to the claim. And then finally, you have a concluding statement, which can often include a transition into the next paragraph. So when you're writing an outline, it's important for you to think about these kind of aspects of a paragraph. If you have these pieces, all you have to do is kind of put in the connective tissue between everything, and you have a good paragraph. So consider this. In the SWOT analysis, you have a pretty clear idea of what a paragraph is supposed to do. The main argument, quote unquote, of a paragraph is going to be to list the strengths and to explain those strengths. But when you're making a more argumentative or persuasive document, this is a really important thing to think about. Keeping your ideas straight, keeping them focused, and having a clear trajectory for your audience of your reasoning. So finally, I want to end today's presentation thinking about the ethical considerations of what you're going to be creating and the kind of arguments or persuasive acts you're going to be doing with business writing. And to think about this in terms of ethics as an ethical consideration, I think is really an important factor in choosing what to write. And so I just want to go down this list of things. When you are dealing with evidence, don't use false evidence, misrepresented, distorted, or irrelevant evidence. Don't intentionally use unsupported or illogical reasoning. Don't try to talk your way around an issue simply to, deceive your audience. Don't use irrelevant appeals to divert attention away from what you're trying to say. For example, don't use emotional appeals simply to divert attention away from the fact that you don't have any logical appeal to work with. Don't ask your audience to link your claim to values or motives. Don't ask your audience to link your claim to values or motives that aren't actually related. Don't conceal your real purpose, your position, or your self-interest. Don't misrepresent or distort the features or consequences of a given action. Don't use emotional appeals that lack good reasoning. Don't oversimplify things, especially when they are actually quite complex. Don't pretend that there is certainty in a specific issue when there isn't, and in fact, often there is not. Most often there is not. And don't advocate something you don't believe. A lot of these are about paying attention to your audience and being ethical towards your audience, but also be ethical towards yourself. Don't advocate something you don't believe. So in addition to this idea of ethics and ethical considerations, I want you also to be thinking about how you take from other sources. And obviously, you're going to be citing your sources using Chicago style, which is an industry standard for business work. But there's other ways that you actually take from other sources. You summarize, which is reducing a concept to its most basic point. You paraphrase, which is actually rewriting information in your own words. The difference between these two is summary is a reduction, paraphrase is a simple restating. So it's actually a difference in size. Quotation, obviously placing written language in quote marks and citing that source. Something that students often have trouble with is patch writing whenever they're paraphrasing or summarizing. Patch writing is cutting and pasting fragments and piecing them together in your own words. Often students will just take the structure of a sentence and replace the words with synonyms. This is patch writing. It's not restating or rewriting information. In general, when you're choosing between whether to summarize or paraphrase or quote, you want to quote for language and you want to paraphrase or summarize for ideas. If you can't say something better, you want to quote. If you can synthesize the ideas and put them into better terms, you want to paraphrase and summarize. So finally, a checklist. Just in general, as you plan this document, this SWOT analysis, determine your purpose. General means whether you're entertaining, you're informing, or you're persuading. And then you have a specific purpose, which is your desired outcome. Make sure that purpose is realistic. Make sure you've got your timing right, that you're not taking up too much time from your audience. Determine your audience's size, their makeup, their knowledge and awareness of the topic. Make sure your sources are credible. The message reflects positively on your business. Anticipate probable responses. So again, this is about thinking about your audience. Select the correct medium and make sure information is accurate, ethical, and important. And that is it as far as planning, drafting, researching.